So I'm excited to talk to you about podcasting because you have an amazing podcast, RDU on Stage, that I'd love to listen to. And I'm interested to hear, when we talked about podcasting, you always seem to have things that I didn't expect, surprises that make podcasting seem like it really is a great thing for artists and arts organizations. And it's not this giant, intimidating, scary thing that you can't do. So one of the things that always seems to me like, how would I do a podcast is, a lot of the technical stuff, like all the scary technical parts. So what do you think is like one of the biggest myths about the technical parts of podcasting?
I think that you need a lot of equipment. People, I think that you need a studio setup or you need a lot of equipment. And truthfully, I do not have a studio setup. But some people do. They rent studio space, shadow box, studio setups around that you can rent space. But for me, I like to go to where my guests are because they're more comfortable in their space than me dragging them into a studio. So I have a very simple setup. It didn't cost me a lot to start up. So it's an affordable way to get your messaging out there. And when I started, I really wasn't sure what the messaging was going to be or the branding was going to be. I wasn't sure what it was going to be, but I have found it to be a very affordable way to brand and market RDU on Stage, really. And it's a low cost way, I think, for artists. Having come from the visual artist world, I'm very cognizant of the fact that as artists, you don't just want people to invest in your product. You don't want people to buy one painting and they're done. You want people to invest in you. And for my money, I think podcasting is a wonderful platform to build an audience, to build a community around your product, to give people behind the scenes look. If you think of it like a virtual audio artist statement, except it's ongoing. And so that's where I think artists can really use it.
And I love that idea of virtual audio artist statement.
It's like an audio artist statement, but it's an ongoing thing. So,
right.
As artists, even though most of us just have one artist statement that doesn't really change, our process changes, our inspiration changes, our day-to-day life changes, and people find that very interesting. I mean, that's one of the things I realized as a visual artist. I didn't necessarily think my process was interesting, but my customers thought my process was really interesting or what inspired me. And so at that time, podcasting wasn't a big deal. We had blogs, but this is just an audio blog, if you think of it that way.
And I like the idea of it being something that you can change, because so often when I talk to an artist and, I'll say, hey, I need your bio or I need your artist statement, they'll give me their artist statement. And the first thing they say when they give me their artist statement is, this is really out of date, or this represents the work I was doing last year or 5 years ago. It's not keeping up with their changes that they've gone through. And
I don't know that artists are very good at selling themselves, marketing themselves all the time. A lot of artists are not very good at putting something on paper like an ad sheet or a media sheet or a press release. But podcasting, you're literally just being yourself and talking to an audience and building a community around you and your brand and your product. So it's a much more natural, less intimidating way. If you can get over some of the technical elements, which there's a little bit of a learning curve, but if you wait until you're going to get it perfect, you're never going to jump into podcasting. So you just have to kind of learn under fire.
Yeah, I actually listened to a podcast recently, and it was some podcasters talking about one of them said, and I should look up exactly who this was, but she said, like, your first 50 podcasts are going to be awful no matter what. So just make them and get them out of the way. And then I thought of like your first 50 paintings. Like I remember when I, was taking painting classes in college and having a professor say, your first 100 watercolors are going to be ugly. Let's just get them done, so that you can move on and actually make what you want to make. you know.
It's true. You know, it's funny. Sometimes I'll meet people and they're like, I'm binging your podcast. And I'm now on episode 63, but people will tell me that they're binging the podcast and they're on episode 30. I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry. You should have started at episode 30 and then like worked your way. Because I listened to some of those early ones and they just sound terrible to me. But, and I did make a lot of mistakes. And, I think that's part of it is trial and error and figuring out what works for you. And so, there were times that I forgot to hit the record button. I forgot to turn a mic on. And so those early episodes, I'm kind of like, yeah, don't start binging from episode 1. Start binging from like episode 30.
So I think though that sometimes those, when I'm listening to a podcast and there's those errors in them, or, things that the podcaster probably doesn't like, I find that I have a lot of generosity towards podcasters because I feel like they're creating this content that I really enjoy and I listen to, and I'm hearing it in my ear. So it seems like more intimate and not, it just feels like it's a conversation between friends, even if it's something that obviously they broadcast out to tens of thousands of people. But it is also, I feel like I have a generosity because, there's this idea like, do people make money podcasting? And talking to you, I've kind of learned that that's, maybe not always the case. There's other reasons for a podcast. It's not a path to riches.
I do agree with that. I think, there's a lot of myths when it comes to podcasting, but I think one of the biggest myths is that people are making money, and I really don't think people are. So if artists are looking to get rich quick, podcasting is probably not the best way to figure that out. However, if people are looking at podcasting as an extension of their marketing and content strategy, podcasting is a quick-ish, affordable way to stream content in people's cars, on people's phones. Podcasts are on demand. People can listen to them wherever they feel like listening to them. So it's different than a video. It's different than a blog post that somebody actually has to be intentional and read. You can listen to a podcast picking up your kids in the carpool line. So it's very accessible for people and it's free. I think another myth is that podcasts are not free. There are expenses on the podcaster's end, but to listen and to subscribe to most podcasts, some people are going to a subscription model now, but most podcasts are free.
Well, and I think to me, that's a really valuable part of it for artists is if you have, for your work or for your arts organization, if you want to talk about what you're doing, if you can get people to listen for 10 minutes or 20 minutes or 30 minutes to you at a time that's convenient for them to learn more about what you're doing, to learn more about your process, to learn more about, the organization that you're running. I think that's such a valuable thing. And to me, a well worth your time for marketing.
Absolutely. I think it is. And, if you think about the visual art, when I was a visual artist and I was doing shows, there's kind of a season and then it drops off. So you have all of these shows and then you have months of downtime where it's just kind of dead. And you don't want your customers to forget you. So literally the way to put the bug in their ear on a regular basis is through podcasting. It's a great way to remind people that you're still around, that you're still working, that you're creating new work for next season's shows. It's a really great marketing tool without having to spend a lot of money. Because, we all can advertise in magazines and stuff, I guess, if you have the funds to do that. But most artists don't. And so once you make the initial investment in whatever your equipment is going to be, and there's some people who spend a lot of money on equipment, there's some people who podcast on their phones. So the expenses can be whatever you can afford. And then the ongoing expenses are really relatively cheap. If you already have a website, you're 90% of the way there, because most of the expenses when it comes to podcasting have to do with a website, having a website to support it.
Yeah, that sounds great. So what are some other things that beginners or people who are considering podcasting might want to know that could help them decide if podcasting was right for them?
I think it's really important for podcasters to understand the law. There's a lot of legality, although podcasters are not licensed in the same way that broadcasters are. You know, if you want to broadcast on radio, you have some sort of license and hours under your belt. Podcasting, you can do it from your home, turn on a recording, and you're done. So you don't fall under the same licensing laws, but you do fall under copyright laws. And so I think a lot of podcasters think, oh, I own my favorite CD and this is a source of inspiration for me, so I'm going to play music on my podcast. And that's a surefire way to get sued. There are a lot of big podcast media companies like iBus Media. They just got sued by Universal because they were using music unlawfully on their podcast. So I think one of the things I do try to tell people is before you jump in, please understand the legalities of it, and then for yourself, kind of come up with the best practices so that you hold yourself accountable and you're not getting in trouble. It's easy to get in trouble, so right. Don't get in trouble. It's too much work to get sued.
Well, especially if the yeah, especially if a big, big podcasting company, if one of their podcasters can get in trouble,
Yes, and there are ways. I mean, if you're really married to music and you really want to use music on your podcast, or you're a performance artist and you have certain songs in your playlist that you want to share, there's legal ways to do it that are actually affordable. So I'm happy to share those with people, but I think it's important to understand the legalities of podcasting. The other thing is, although there's not a big financial investment with podcasting, there is a time investment. So I don't think people should just think that you record something and it's perfect and it's done and it's up. My podcast is about 30 minutes, sometimes less. It takes anywhere from 5 to 20 hours just to edit an episode. And I'm a perfectionist, but even Audacity, which is a popular editing software, they'll tell you that it takes, for every 1 minute of audio, it takes about 4 minutes of work. So for an hour podcast, it could take 4 to 5 hours just to produce, and that's the minimum. So I think people have to understand the financial commitment isn't huge, but the time commitment might be. And I tell people it's a marathon, not a sprint. You don't just build it and they'll listen. It doesn't work. Like, if you build it, they will listen. It doesn't work that way. I think it's a matter of building an audience over time and committing to multiple episodes, a series, a season. A lot of podcasts are seasonal, so you don't have to do it every week or every month. You can do it consistently, but not, it's based on your schedule. So, but you should commit to more than 1 or 2 episodes to reap the benefits.
Well, and I can see too, like, as you mentioned before, if you're a visual artist and you do shows and you have a show season, so you can also spend part of your off season constructing and, figuring out your podcast, and then having your podcast ready and have it come out, periodically during that time so that it can back your work up.
Absolutely. And a lot of people use their podcast as a springboard for video content. There's a lot of podcasters who produce videos out of their podcasts, and that just gives them a whole new world on YouTube. So now you have your Apple platform, your Spotify platform, all your digital platforms, and now if you have a video element, now you've increased that to YouTube and Facebook and Instagram TV. So in this world of on-demand media, which I think everybody is so used to right now, podcasting is an on-demand way to get your message to your customers at their convenience. So I love it for that. And then, it's very lovely to hear. I mean, right now we're sitting in this weird self-isolation quarantine time. There's a lot of teachers going virtual right now. Several theater teachers reached out to me to say, I'm using your podcast and assigning episodes to my students to supplement my curriculum. How great would it be for a living artist in the Triangle to have their work being used as curriculum enhancement? So at a time like this. So I think there's all sorts of benefits to it.
Yeah, definitely.
Creating content is good.
Well, I also find that talking about your work often deepens your, particularly for visual artists, because often visual artists are making and doing their work without sort of prior contemplation. It just comes from that visual part of our brains. And so then when you have to use words to sort of to someone, it lets you recognize and deepen what you actually were doing. It lets you sort of recognize what you did, and put a name to those actions that you took, which I think can be really helpful both for the artist and for other artists that listen to it.
And for the audience. Artists are terrible at selling their work. I mean, they're great creators, but artists are terrible salespeople for the most part. I mean, no offense to the art community, but a lot of the artists I've met, they are fantastic creators. But when it comes to selling and marketing themselves, that's not their strong point. And so even if you ask somebody to write an artist statement, typically it takes them forever because it's just not a natural skill set for them. So talking about it and sharing it audibly and verbally is a much more accessible way for the artist to express themselves than putting it on paper, putting it in a spreadsheet, putting it on an ad sheet or something like that.
Yeah. I definitely agree with that.
So everybody should podcast. Well, it's not for everybody, but I think people who commit to it, it can be incredibly rewarding and exciting and beneficial. I mean, there's just silly things. I was standing in my kitchen one day and I said, hey, Alexa, play the RD on Stage podcast. And it did. And my kids were like super impressed. So, it's the little things.
We can impress our teenagers.
So
we've gone far. Yeah. So, well, we're looking forward to the workshop that you're going to be teaching for Triangle Artworks and Artswell. And I know that a lot of our artists in the area are really looking forward to it as well, Lauren.
I hope so. This was a workshop I put together for the American Critics Association. One of the critics from a well-known trade magazine had asked me to put this together for our association, and it went really well. I'm excited here because I'll actually have a little bit more time to present. I won't be so rushed, and I'll be able to open it up to more questions and input. So I'm excited about that. Thank you for the opportunity to Triangle Artworks.
I know, we're super excited, Lauren, so we can't wait.